ICF publication Underfoot. We'd like to take and welcome everybody here to our dirt meeting. And we're just going to get in there and we're going to get downright and dirty. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Clayton to let her get us informed about dirt.
Okay, well, here I am, downright and dirty. And up on the screen right there, we've got the format for how we were going to do this morning. I was going to start off by talking about how the hoof interacts with the ground, to give you that sort of background of the hoof and the ground and what's going on between them. And then Nick is going to talk about the impact of footing, so the actual nuts and bolts of the footing itself. And then we're going to throw it open for discussion. And maybe Dr. Martinelli will be here by then, and if he's not, we'll just scrub his name off the credits. So why is footing important? Well, it's important for performance. If we want our horses looking as if they're just bouncing off the ground, then we need a footing that is non-painful to any existing small injuries or arthritis, and also footing that physically helps the horse to get bounced off the ground. Footing is important for soundness. The majority of injuries in our dressage horses are repetitive strain type injuries. And the footing certainly plays a huge role both in keeping our horses sound and in causing the most common lamenesses that we see. And the third reason is for safety. I said that most of our injuries are repetitive strain type injuries, so they develop over a long period of time, but there can be some problems with the footing when the footing is very inconsistent or slippery that can lead to acute injuries. So the interface of the hoof with the ground is very important. And in particular, there are two phases in the horse's stride when this interaction is particularly significant for the soundness and performance of the horse. The first of these is impact, which you see this foot here just impacting the ground at the beginning of the stance phase. And then in the later part of the stance phase, when the foot is pushing off against the ground and providing propulsion for the horse, this is the other sort of critical phase of the stride in relation to this hoof-ground interface. And along with that, we have certain characteristics of the footing that are important during the impact phase and during the push-off phase. And these would be the impact resistance of the footing and the shear resistance or the shear strength of the footing, respectively. So at the moment that the hoof hits the ground, the hoof is moving forwards and downwards. And in order for the horse to feel stable on the ground, the hoof has to be brought to rest. So it has to be decelerated in the forwards and downward direction. And as that happens, following contact of the hoof with the ground, there is energy generated during that deceleration phase. And that energy travels up the horse's limb as a shock wave. Right? So we have the hoof here, which is traveling forwards and downwards into the footing. And I keep lasering Nick's head here.
I wonder what's burning.
It's okay. And as the foot is decelerated, we get this shock wave traveling up the horse's leg. And that shock wave is what we know as concussion. So the shock or concussive wave has a high magnitude and a rapid vibration frequency. And those characteristics make it particularly damaging to the hard tissues in the horse's limb, so to the bones and the joints. So the impact phase is very important in relation to injuries of the bones and the joints. Now, the horse's body has some mechanisms for dissipating this impact shock or dissipating the concussion. And one thing that happens is that the joints flex or bend immediately after the hoof hits the ground. So, and when I say immediately, I'm talking about within milliseconds. This is not seconds, this is thousandths of a second. And what I've got here is a horse's foot just after contact, and the stick figure is showing the angles of the joints. Well, immediately after the hoof hits the ground, those joints are flexing. And it would be the same thing as if I jumped off this stage. If I jumped with my ankles and knees rigid, I would get a huge concussive shock, a real jarring shock. Whereas if I allowed my knees and ankles to bend as I land, then it very much cushions the shock. And the horse's joints are doing the same thing. They're bending to cushion that impact shock. Now, there are also tissues within the limb that will absorb some of the shock. And the picture on the right is just a section through the middle of actually a foal's limb. And you can see the cannon bone, the fetlock joint, the pastern joint, the coffin joint. I can't see very well from here, so I hope I'm pointing at the right things. But at each of those joints, you can see a thin white layer. And that layer is the articular cartilage, or the joint cartilage, which is a very efficient tissue for absorbing shock. It's like a little cushion in the joint. But the problem is that that cartilage is only present in a very thin layer at the joints. So there's a limit to how much shock it can absorb. And then the bone immediately underneath the cartilage, it's called the subchondral bone. It's another pretty good shock-absorbing tissue. So there are several ways in which the horse's hoof, through a hemodynamic mechanism, the bones through the cartilage and the subchondral bone, and the joints through their flexion activity, are all able to dissipate some of this concussion. But the footing is also really important in terms of how much concussion is generated and how much concussion is absorbed during that foot contact with the ground. And I'm going to leave Nick to talk about that in detail. So what are the effects of this concussion? Well, it varies according to the type of activity that the horse performs. In race horses that are training and racing at very high speeds, impact, shock, and concussion are tremendously high. And the effects, when we have a high magnitude concussion, the effects tend to appear rather early in the horse's career, and the effects that we see in race horses are fractures of the long bones. Now, in our dressage horses, we don't very often see long bone fractures. And this is because the impact shock is a lot lower in magnitude in the type of training that we do. But there's an inverse relationship between the size or magnitude of the shock and the number of loading cycles that it takes to cause damage. So in the race horses with these very high magnitude impact shock, it takes relatively few loading cycles to cause damage. Whereas in our dressage horses, the impact shock wave is a lot lower, so the horses can sustain many, many more loading cycles over a career that's not only a few months or a couple of years long, but a career that is maybe 12, 15 years long. But eventually, impact shock does take its toll. And what we see in not just in dressage horses, but in all sport horses, is eventually the development of arthritis, osteoarthritis or degenerative joint disease. And the picture on the right there shows a horse with a severe high ring bone at the pastern joint. And in fact, the ring bone is so severe that it's completely fused that pastern joint. It tends to be the joints furthest down the horse's limb that are subjected to the most impact shock. So the coffin joint, the pastern joint, the fetlock joint, and the hock joint are where we see most of these arthritic problems that arise as an effect of concussion.